So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Good afternoon if you're in the Middle East. Good morning if you are in DC or anywhere on the Eastern Seaboard. Thank you for joining us. My name is Myriad. I am the director of the Egypt program for the Middle East Institute. And today's event is a slight departure from our usual events for this program. Generally, we tend to deal with economics and security. However, there has been such a lot of movement on this front recently in Egypt, such a lot of discussion, such a lot of action, that because of the way it relates and has a direct effect on the social development, the political development, the economic development of the country, we thought it was important to take a quick look at what was happening, why it was happening, and what this meant for the country in general. We are very, very lucky with our panelists at the moment. You have their bios, so I won't go into detail. But Dr. Huda Sadda wears many, many hats, but I've been reliably informed that the two that are most important to her are that she is currently Professor of English Comparative Literature at Cairo University, and that she is the co-founder of the Women in Memory Forum, which we'll be hearing more about later on. Ms. Mosna Hassan, we are equally delighted and privileged to have with us. And Mosna is the founder and director of Nazra for Feminist Studies. All right. We're going to kick straight off into the questions. Please be aware that you can, if you have questions, generally we keep them to the last sort of 20 minutes, but if you have questions at any time, please feel free to shoot them in through the Q&A function in Zoom. By now everybody's used to Zoom, and I'll see them. If I can include them in the conversation, I will. If not, then I will say we have a question, and I will try and take them in the order in which they've come in, and we will do it like that. All right. So thank you again for joining us. Women, it is odd that we are still talking about women's rights in a country that has apparently been at the forefront of women's rights for almost 100 years now. But like we said, much has been happening. There has been much discussion about the position of women, the duties of women, the roles of women, and women's participation in the labor force. They are underrepresented in Egypt, make up half the population, but not half the labor force, which of course has ramifications on the economy, which we'll look at perhaps another time. But for now, I want to kick off with a look at why this discussion is happening now, what the history and context perhaps is, so that we can understand the discussion going forward. And perhaps I can turn to Dr. Sadda for that.
Right, thank you, Myriad. I'm very, very happy to participate in this discussion. So the context, I mean, to begin with, lots of discussions happened recently around personal status laws. And I will begin by saying that activism to change the personal status laws in Egypt can be regarded as a defining characteristic of the women's movement since its inception in the early 20th century. So, to understand what's happening, we really need to think a little bit historically. But the immediate context of the debate was news in February 2021 that the cabinet approved a draft proposal for a new personal status law and sent it to Parliament for review and endorsement. Now, the draft proposal was leaked, so we managed to see it, but it was very disappointing, to say the least, as it consolidated the gendered inequalities in the current personal status law and added new restrictions on women's legal capacity. Now, just to give everyone a sense of what we're talking about, women in the existing law, PSL, as well as in the proposed draft, have the status of legal minors, and they remain subordinate to the tutelage of a male member of the family, the father, the husband, the brother, the uncle, who can intervene and make decisions on behalf of women or women in the family that can restrict and create regulatory and bureaucratic obstacles that impede their mobility, guardianship of their children, the ability to marry the partner of their choice, many things. Now, this state of affairs is due to the governing logic of the current personal status law, which assumes that women, regardless of their age and their experience, and this is, I underline these 2 points, are always under some sort of wilaya or guardianship or tutelage of a male member of the family. Now, this assumed wilaya will not, while maybe not directly stated in every single letter of the law, every single article, but it is a guiding principle and is assumed by legislators and is translated into decisions and regulations implemented by state institutions. So to give you an example, a mother will be told by a bank, for example, that she cannot open a savings account on behalf of her young children and will be requested to obtain the permission of the father. Now, again, because this is not like a written law, but somehow an assumed governing logic of the law, so not all banks will follow the same procedure. So some bank will allow a woman to open an account for her children, but after she deposits the money, she will be denied access to the account, but the father, the wali, can have access to the account. And many, many examples, women, for example, can't transfer their children from one school to another without the consent or permission from the father. Now, briefly, the larger context of the debate, of this debate, is this conflation we have in Egypt in the national imaginary between personal status laws and religion. Now, personal status laws were issued in the 1920s on the basis of Sharia and a process of inclusion and exclusion of interpretations of fiqh resulted in the codification of principles and rules that institutionalize the control of men over women in the domain of the family. Now, this conflation was consolidated and reaffirmed by the First Republic and the modern nation state when laws were changed in 1956. Now, these laws granted women universal suffrage and equal rights in the public sphere, but did not extend its modernizing project to address inequalities in the private sphere. And since then, we've seen several amendments introduced, 79, 2000, 2005, very important amendments that helped improve the lives of women, the legal status of women in the family, but they remained minor amendments and never addressed the philosophy of the law or the governing logic that consolidated women's subordination to male members of their family. So in effect, what we see, the personal status law, unfortunately, became the territory of religious institutions and patriarchal state officials, and the site for the practice of authority and power over society and over the more secular parties in the state. Now, the League proposal mobilized feminist groups to combine efforts to reject the law, lobby against it. So we've seen many, many initiatives that rejected this proposal. One of them, I just mentioned briefly, was a campaign called El Wilaya Haqqi, or to translate as guardianship is my right, This was one campaign. It was a social media campaign. It was launched by the Women and Memory Forum, so I was involved in mid-March. And the hashtag El Wilaya Haqqi went viral and became the second most popular trend on Twitter and Facebook and so on for a couple of days. Now, despite the ongoing restrictions on activism in the public sphere and serious deterrent, I'll just end here and say that actually the campaign succeeded in attracting the attention of wide audiences. It mobilized the participation of many women. Ordinary men and women were able to participate, tell their stories, and consequently reject the proposed amendments. And it was picked up and discussed in media outlets and so on. But perhaps I can talk a little bit more about the campaign later on. I'll stop here, I think.
Thank you so much. I don't want to tie you up, but I would like to come back to the campaign to the role of religion, and whether there is, or the perceived role of religion, not so much the role of religion, the perceived role of the religion, and possibly whether there is some tension, friction, or at least a tug for leverage, if you like, between the government, more secular, and a more established patriarchal religious role. Muslim, it actually kicks off another question about something that we've been discussing earlier. Muslim, if I can come back to you for a bit. Generally speaking, at least when people outside Egypt talk about women's rights, they're often shoved into a corner of the larger human rights debate. And you were saying that occasionally tends to obscure the reality or the work that's being done. Am I right?
Yeah, thank you, Myriad, and thank you for having me in this conversation, especially with Dr. Huda Sadda, our wise feminist. We are always calling her this in our movement, and this is thank you, Dr. Huda, for explaining this history, because I do think that what's important while we are discussing what's so-called women's rights, feminism, are we discussing women, or are we discussing women, gender, and feminism in our country? Because most of the time our issue, like you were saying in the beginning, Myriad, that usually you are not speaking or talking about women because you are speaking more about economic insecurity. And this is one of the problematization of the issue while we are speaking about our movement in the international scene. I know that I'm saying this too much while I'm invited in international speaking, especially DC and this EU discussion, that I think we are underrepresented internationally because there is this stereotype you are speaking about, Myriad, about our movement, that most of the time we have this stereotype internationally and locally that most of us are speaking about certain issues. It is as if all women are the same, and as if it is either state or other political group issues, not as an independent feminist movement has been growing and changing and honestly responding to different things all this history. And I do think that the last 10 years is different in this, not because we are different generations, but I think the context also was different in the last 10 years, which brought this focus on how an independent movement can go and interact, and also targeted and pressured all in the last 10 years. So I think that we are not cornered in our activities, and what Huda has been speaking about, الولاية حقي, is one of these examples. About most of the people think that personal status law and its amendment is just those crazy feminist issue, and we found by this hashtag that it is an issue for general women and men, honestly, in this issue, cross cultures, ethnics, classes, and understanding of what is personal status law. I think that what happened in the last 10 years, and with all the problems we are facing in our situation now, that this growing of this independent grassroots multi-classes focusing and tools movement is existing. I don't know if I respond to your question or not, but I want to.
No, I think you did. Thank you. I think because again, I do think that one of the problems is human rights is seen as one big entity, and it's sort of a one size fits all, and every country has to struggle towards full rights, privileges and duties for its citizens. But I don't think that there's a one size fits all answer or agenda for everyone. And I think this it does tend to get lost in the conversation. which brings us on to something again that we're discussing. This is, I mean, none of this is a particularly new question. I mean, and it's not a particularly new discussion either. There has been one struggle after another, and I think, as we were discussing, a lot of the changes in the laws have come in response to other situations or other conditions. Hoda, could you maybe expand on that or explain that to me?
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you. I mean, and I totally agree with Muzna about, I mean, looking at the very specific details that will give us a different approach to how to address all of these issues. Now, let me just say that, I mean, I would like to also, I mean, respond to the question. I mean, why are we having this? What is happening now and why? And then come back to al-wilaya haqi perhaps and think about how things have changed differently. It is important to understand the last 10 years of women's activism, of course, always to highlight the 25th of January in 2011. And I mean, it's been a transformative moment. It's really resulted in a very important shift in many things, obviously, but definitely thinking of women's rights and women's activism and activism for gender justice. Things have moved forward in very significant ways. Why? I mean, the 20th of January opened up political spaces, enabled the articulation and confrontation of taboo issues, and particularly issues related to sexuality and women's bodies. So sexual violence, which used to be taboo, it was addressed by women's groups earlier in the 90s and the 2000s, but definitely the taboo was broken after 2011, with the visibility of women in public squares, their participation in acts of defiance, their activism for change, all of these things empowered them to articulate what has been left unsaid, I think, for decades. And of course, I mean, the role of women's groups in helping and supporting survivors of violence, I mean, cannot be underestimated. It's really important. And of course, I'm happy that Muzna is with us because Nazra played a really important role during these events. So we always say that feminist activism, I mean, one of the uncontested gains of the 25th of January revolution has been the breaking of taboo around sexual violence and the moving forward with this whole issue. I mean, let's think of, I mean, important changes in legislation that happened in the last few years. So definitely, I mean, if we think of the 2014 Constitution and the Article 11 that commits the state to combating violence against women, I see it and I always explain it as an achievement that is based on what happened in 25th of January and the way, you know, the whole issue of sexual violence was brought to the fore. It became a media, you know, an issue discussed in the media in unprecedented ways. So the Constitution, definitely the anti-sexual harassment decree that was passed in June 2014 is another important, I think, milestone. Again, a change in legislation that addressed what was previously a taboo issue. So these are all important, I think, milestones for us to remember and to understand how what is happening now really builds on all these milestones. I mean, nothing happens, you know, out of a vacuum, right? It's really an accumulative progress, and women's groups have been very key to all this progress. So to go back to the, you know, I mean, perhaps maybe I can identify two important campaigns that happened recently. And that's relevant to your question, Myriad. I mean, so in 2020, there was a really important campaign against sexual violence by a group, by an Instagram, what's it called, website. So I'm not an Instagram person, but definitely Assault Police. This was a young initiative, and definitely it's important, and maybe Muslim will probably talk about this later. It was important in exposing sexual predators, and the whole issue of sexual violence again came to the fore and became very important. And then I'll come back to the الولاية حقي and just perhaps talk a little bit about why it's been so impactful, let me just say. I mean, it captured the imagination of women beyond the feminist, if you like, community, right? I mean, again, we've always been accused, as Mosny says, of being a close community. We talk to each other. We're talking about issues that only concern a certain group of women. And this turned out to be absolutely untrue, because the way women and men actually engaged with this, with the hashtag, revealed that this was really a very, it was something, it touched a core. It resonated with many, many young men and women, and old men and women, by the way. It was really, there was no generational division here. So now, why did this happen? I would argue that the previous amendments that we have seen, amendments of the law, 79, 2000, and so on, have always been, I don't want to call them cosmetic, because they were not. They were important amendments, but they were minor in the sense that they only addressed very specific issues that were resulting in huge social problems. So for example, in 79, there was this huge problem, a housing problem, where women who were divorced found themselves on the street with their children, because if they were kicked out of the marital home, they had no place to go. So the law was changed and actually linked the marital home with the children, the person who has custody over the children. So this was an important amendment because it really saved the lives of many, many women, right? And their children, obviously, the whole family. Again, similarly, the Khola law in 2000, very important, because what happened was that courts were clogged with cases of divorce cases. Women had to go to court and stay in court for over 10 years sometimes to get a divorce, while of course their divorcee, their ex-husbands were able to marry and have a life and, you know, continue with their lives and so on. So this amendment was really important because it gave women a way out, basically, of a terrible situation. So all of the amendments really targeted very specific social crises, but never ever addressing the core issue, what I describe as the governing logic of the law, the fact that women are subordinate to male members of their family in the private sphere, that women continue to be treated as legal minors. And I think this captured the imagination of many, many women, because we understand what it means, really. I mean, we all understand what it means. I'm a university professor, understands very well that she can't transfer her children from one school to another without going back to her husband. So, I mean, you know, very strange contradictions. The minister in the cabinet either cannot do that. So I think this was something that really resonated in a very, very impactful way.
So thank you. I'm going to want to come back to that afterwards, because I mean, when you mentioned Khola, for example, that's a 1400-year-old law. This is a law enshrined in Sharia. It is not a new thing that the courts whipped up to be kind to women. So my question would really be, and I'll just give you a second to breathe, would really be why the cut and paste attitude, the reluctance to consider women as a whole entity, if you like. Is it merely a religious patriarchy? Really, why are we still having this issue in a country that, as I said, has been at the forefront of women's rights for 100 years? But I'm going to give you a second to just collect that, and I'm going to shoot back to Mosny for a second, because we brought up something really, really important. There has been a raft of pro-women legislation. There has been a lot of fairly good legislation for women, whether it's in business. I mean, there is the new boards law, gender parity boards law, which I don't think exists anywhere else in the Middle East. The sexual harassment law, you noticed, I mean, we have more women in cabinet. In Egypt has more women in cabinet than ever, but we still, we are still seeing this issue. Egypt still has this issue, and there is often a tendency to lay it at the feet of one convenient entity, whether it is the government, whether it is Al-Azhar, whether it is various state-owned councils. Is it that simple, or is it more complex? Why does Egypt still has this friction between legislation and real life?
I think it's important to narrate the story within certain perception to understand why it's happening. And I love to narrate this story from the eye of the feminist activist and the movement, because I do think that maybe this can open some dark areas for people who are not seeing the picture. I think it is about the movement, because we have been learned, in our generation, which we are old now, and we are trying to tell others that patriarchal people are not giving women rights by themselves. You couldn't find patriarchal people in the morning saying that women are not in a better situation in our country and we need to do better for them. This is not happening. And this is the case about Egypt. We have ever led by patriarchal people. Patriarchal have different perception about how they are seeing patriarchy, but it is patriarchal and not positive masculinity by any way. So we are struggling
I'm sorry.
In any positive masculinity perspective. It is this fragile masculinity all the time, that they are afraid that if we can gain something, this means that we will lead more than them. And this is one of the problems in how we as feminists and feminist activists are seeing this generally, and it has been implementing in different what's so-called authorities in different places. And because of that, the story is important. As Huda has been speaking about how feminists have been struggling for years before 2011, and how she mentioned 2011 is turning point, because it was the space of the check and balance we didn't have before. That there is an existence and acceptance of what so-called movements, and we as people used to be irrelevant, we are relevant in a way, so our ideas have been implemented in a way. So seeing the sexual harassment article, not law, this is so important, because this is one of the tricks in the language people love to say all the time. It is the process that we as movement from 2011, when everyone told us that you are westernized, you are not part of this society, women can get their rights when everyone can be in a better situation. We have been struggling in this public and private and movement and democratization, and we have been in the public sphere, and the question of violence in the public and the private was in the core of the struggle of this movement for these years. And honestly, it is about us that we struggle, but also we have been facing a lot. And this article came after more than hundreds of women have been gang raped and sexually assaulted in Egypt systematically within Tahrir Square and the places around it. And the movement around this, that those who have been struggling for this narrative that it is our right to exist and our right to be protected, not in a patriarchal way, but as citizens, have been contradicting every one narration about the revolution or pro or against it. So people wanted to co-opt us within the year of the Muslim Brotherhood to say that, yes, this how people who hate the Muslim Brotherhood are facing while they are protesting with their thugs, or others who were pro the revolution have been accusing and pressuring us to stop talking because they love this romanticization about the revolution and the Tahrir and other places. And those who are ruling all this time, they don't want to accept their responsibility to have citizens who could be protected. And we standed within all those people. And really we standed as this collective, different movement, and with this grassroots work, but also with this policy and law, and trying to work within this systematic changes. So we were the people who have been suggesting this drafts of amending different articles in the Egyptian Penal Code at this time, and they choose only the sexual harassment article. We were the people who decided to challenge the policies and ask for national strategy to combat violence against women. And we had at this time a response from the head of the National Council for Women at this time, and this has been implementing, not the way we wanted, but the issue has been. And I couldn't speak about the process of the Constitution of 2014 while Dr. Huda is here, and she is the one who wrote it, but this also was the struggle and the check and balance for the feminist movement, which began from 2011. Working on this process, which was an initiative came by Women and Memory Forum, Women and Constitution, and we struggled within the year of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we struggled after that in this constitution. So I know I'm speaking too much, but I think narrating the story from what has been happened to find this article is important, because it will give us this message and the reality about why we don't have new things happening until now, because this is also about how this movement is not allowed to exist. And this is one of the things I think it's important to be seen. So seeing the number of women in cabinet or the number of women in the parliament, it's important to see the constitution and how the process of women and integrating women and women's issues in the constitution is important.
Okay, Moza, let me ask you something, because you touched on a couple of very, very important things. And we had a question come up that sort of reflected something that you were saying. You mentioned that the movement, people had attempted to co-opt the movement during the time of former President Mohamed Morsi, and people were saying, what will happen to women if this government continues. But then, from what you're saying, people have attempted to co-opt this movement over and over and over, and essentially this movement is struggling with being co-opted by various rights groups, by the state, by various patriarchies, really by a lot of different areas. So how do you manage to carve out an area that is dedicated to women's rights, as opposed to being a shadow or a mirror or foil for someone else's discussion? And really, how useful has it been it's nice for Egypt to have women in cabinet and in parliament, but how useful has that been to the struggle for women's rights in Egypt?
Yeah, I think, and I was responding to this question when I was speaking about the days of the Muslim Brotherhood, because also I'm always cautious about the story, because this is something important, that most of the people have been seeing the protests in 2013 or even 2011. I remember after the 18 days, many international media came to me, was so surprised that women are protesting in Egypt. And I was like, okay, you even didn't understand that we are the people of the in the public sphere, and women in Egypt are in the public sphere. I have been raised in Saudi Arabia. I know how women in that time wasn't in the public sphere, but in Egypt we are in the public sphere. But the problem about this patriarchy, which has sometimes securitized perspective or so-called Islamist perspective, or sometimes what's so-called right perspective, they want to put us in this shield that you should act like this to be a good woman. And this is how feminists, I think, they are good at understanding patriarchy and multi-layering and intersectionality, so we can act in certain things. But I think what has been poor in 2011 and after that, with all people who like or don't like what happened in 2011, with all the analysis and the deep sadness and other things, there is something happened in Egypt in 2011, that new actors came to the public sphere, and this mobilization idea was there. And I think, and I'm always proud that I'm part of this movement in Egypt and in our region, and especially in Egypt, that we use the momentum and we struggled and understand the reality. So from the beginning, we knew that violence is not our issue as educated women, or if we are educated. But we have been accused of this before the revolution, because I'm part of this generation who has been before and after, that when certain issues has been opened in Egypt about mob sexual harassments in Al-Eid, we have been accused at this time that we are those middle class educated women, and sexual harassment and sexual violence is an issue for you, not the real Egyptian women. And every time when there is a space that women can speak and being mobilized, we found them honestly sometimes ahead of us, because we have this check and balance and we have this pressure all the time. But they see the consciousness when they came to them, they saw it and they spoke about it. So I think it is important to see this, what happened in the last 10 years and how the feminist movement in Egypt is, for me, and is a good example of a movement and dynamic movement at this time. I think because we understood how being independent but not alternative is important, how we have some allies and some and people we are fighting with عادي, not having this and not being intimidated. And honestly, we are a strong movement. We have this amazing moments all the time that we found those survivors or victims coming and speaking and putting us on ourselves, saying that we are speaking up, how can things happen? And also we have been struggling in this, and also we are a movement which understood the intergenerational part. So we were not that amazed and happy that we were young, only like this. And this what is making this movement in being continued. And also I think we understood many of the importance of the policy laws and changing and having that this feminist movement is for women, not for us. But having number of women in cabinet or in the parliament, while maybe I don't agree politically with most of them, it's not my issue. It's the issue of representation is something, but it's not all of the things. And the problem, what's happening, I think that people want to put us all the time in this yes or no question. Do you like the quota? Are you pro the quota or not? And this is not the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let me just pick up something that you said and turn to Huda, just so you can have a quick breather. Huda Mosna mentioned new actors and new situations that had arisen, whether it was new governments or whether it was the revolution in 2011. You had earlier mentioned that, generally speaking, laws in relation to women were reactive rather than proactive. All right. Can you maybe sort of explain that a little bit? And specifically, I'd like to know which of the laws that were reactive you thought were most relevant and were most important to the discussion being had today, and whether you think there is a workaround to the sort of cut and paste approach to legislating for women's rights, and why that is.
Right, thank you. Right, so I think I'll just briefly refer to something I just said earlier, which is how most of the amendments that were introduced on the personal status law were actually basically what I like to describe as sort of like attempts to extinguish social fires, right? So housing problems, so amendment in 79, court cases, numerous court cases, divorce cases, women can't get out of bad or abusive marriages, so the khola. So these have all been, I mean, this is how I feel that the legislator has looked at or has approached the personal status laws, and this is probably what they're trying to do again this time, but they've put their foot into it because really they came up with some really bad suggestions. But that's one thing. But I would like to actually address this issue of why the contradiction. I mean, why is it that we see this really, for a lot of people, for me actually, anyway, for a lot of people, it's unbelievable how we have contradictions in Egypt. I mean, we have definitely a movement towards supporting women, to be cabinet ministers, to be governors. Even now, we're talking about a woman governor. So there's definitely that approach. And I mean, the reality is women are everywhere. I mean, if you look at Cairo University, and I always like to give this example, I mean, the proportion of women professors in Cairo University is actually proportionate to the student population, which is something, by the way, you do not find in American or European universities. And I always like to mention this. So in fact, I mean, that's partly, of course, because of a semi-socialist system. That's another story. But I mean, in the spaces where women have not been tied down by unrealistic regulations, we're everywhere. I mean, public spaces, positions everywhere. But why is it that we have this contradiction? And I think part of the contradiction, and I think this is a point that Muslim pointed at, which is the relationship of the state to social movements. Let me just say that. And maybe we can talk about the wider issue of the relation between the state and civil society or independent organizations. I mean, this is, I think, a real challenge to the women's movement and to all social movements, I would argue, where since the 50s, and this is not a new thing, but since the 50s and since, what happened in the 50s, of course, I mean, this is history, so women were given rights, certain several legislations were introduced to, basically paying attention to the poor, to the working classes, but at the same time, at the very same moment, there was a nationalization of civil society, which was very active actually in the 40s and in the 40s, and where, state basically took over, state institutions became the only possible venues for any kind of expression or articulation of ideas. And of course, this is when we start seeing what we describe as state feminism, which is, it led to certain important improvements, but definitely destroyed or curtailed or limited the women's movement, the independent women's movement. And this is part of our history. And so this kind of very, I call it tense relationship between the modern state and independent civil society work is really one of the reasons why we see all these contradictions. Why is it that something that, we've been lobbying for, our mothers and grandmothers have been lobbying for since, I don't know when, since the 30s, continues to be the same issue that we're lobbying for now, in a way. Changing personal status laws, talking about divorces and so on. So this is how I see it really. It's this tense and it's this tense relationship between the state and independent civil society.
Thank you so much. Muslim, if I can come back to you for just a second. You mentioned that, well, you went through the struggles that the movement is facing. So maybe let's sort of switch over and take a look at the practical side of it. How is the movement moving forward? I mean, and this came up in one of our questions. You know, what forms of advocacy are you using? What strategies are you using? You know, what achievable goals do you think you have? I mean, are there specific guidelines that you are aiming for? How do you categorize success?
Yeah, I think, and responding to the questions about the strategies for Nazra, and Dr. Hoda will speak about the Women and Memory Forum, but I think also it's important to see the context and see how we are defining, I'm speaking about myself, how we are defining the feminist movement. So I do think that this distinction between the social media campaigns and the feminist movement is not what I am seeing the feminist movement. I'm seeing the feminist movement as this big differ, and because I don't like this nationalist approach all the time that we have to be all the same, speaking the same language, doing the things. I do think that the differences is important, and this what I'm speaking about that happened after 2011. So I'm seeing that different groups, ideas, initiatives, because this is one of the things has been opened in the last 10 years, that we found that people are calling themselves as a campaign and then became an initiative, and then they want to register, and others are stopped, others were functioning during certain time and they stopped. And this is about the movement, that it is alive and using different tools. So I think that there are some campaigns coming from so-called the structural organization within the movement. And it's important also to see the context, how, I'm speaking about Nazra, how we are not able to function in different areas, which doesn't make our response is what we expect, not others to expect about us, and how the other groups and other generations. And I think this is also something about the intergeneration. When things has been opened last year in Egypt, and Egypt last year was about women's and sexual violence, every certain group has been speaking about the issue of sexual violence in their groups or publicly, when the two big cases relating to a community like AUC, or what's so-called the upper class community in Egypt, has been the speech of everyone, almost everyone in Egypt in the last year. And I think last year was the year for women, because women's stories of sexual violence has been competing with the pandemic itself. So I think seeing this, I saw those as part of the feminist movement, because this is this generation speaking about their issues within their tools and their understanding. I remember my niece, she's 15 years old, and she was so into this new campaigns and speaking up, and she told me that you are this old generation of Facebook, others we are on Instagram. So I found that this is other kind of feminism, and this different things, how we as structured organizations are responding. It's important to see that not our structural organization, I'm speaking about Nazra, that we decided that we will not work on different all issues because we don't like being one doing everything. And also the response is about the context, and the context is hard. And also being intergenerational, you have to understand that there are other generations which you may be being so old for them. I learned this the hard way in the last years with my niece, but also with this generation, that they're speaking different language. And I remember older feminists when they have been telling me that I'm speaking different language, but it doesn't mean that it's not all feminism advocacy, how it's not translated into laws and regulations and rights, and some gang rapists are out now because this is about the limitation of the check and balance and the existence of the public sphere and ability for people to speak up and struggle like our generation had in certain time.
Okay, so I think you just touched on something very, very important. I think when people discuss sexual violence, one assumes that in any society in the world, there is an amount of sexual violence. But the discussion now, and the fact that you mentioned that the discussion of sexual violence is seen as a class issue, one assumes that sexual violence cuts across all classes in Egypt. But are we saying that the discussion is only a middle class issue? And if that is the case, how do you make yourself relevant? Because one assumes that this class makes up about 2% of Egypt's society. Okay, how do you make yourself relevant to Egyptian women rather than a very, very slim slice of Egyptian women?
Yeah, I think also it's one of the stereotypes about us, and my assumption about class, it doesn't mean that they have to be lower classes or classes with less privilege. I think class issues, that people have different classes, and everyone had the right, by the way, because this is one of being in the stereotype of the whole feminist movement. Everyone has been telling us that if you are all being connected and say the same thing, you could be succeeded. And honestly, we succeeded in the time of differences, not on the time of being monotone, saying the same words. Because being different, that it is allowing people for creativity, speaking about different issues, because no one can speak about one thing. And at the same time, it's about how people are connected to themselves. And I'm always saying this, that violence, I think the violence issue is so relevant to all Egyptian women. And this is one of the importance of understanding the bodily issues of existing in the public and in the private sphere in a social conservative place like Egypt. And you can see it even by statistics. The latest Egyptian demographic survey, and they had a special module on violence against women in the private sphere, and we found that a third of the Egyptian women are facing sexual violence. And sexual violence with married women, that third of the Egyptian women, which is the official statistics, saying that they are facing marital rape. This is in the private sphere. And see how the feminist movement in Egypt have been speaking, in the last 10 years, maybe we have been speaking about the public sphere, not because we were not in the public sphere, because public sphere has been changing. But this is the work of the feminist movement for 100 years, and the private is full of this. The non-recognition of the society, or the accusing of the feminists of being westernized, bad, crazy, or they want to be the stars alone. It is their people heads, it's not in our head. This is what I learned, honestly, because we have been, as a group, we have been targeted in this by different groups, that it's all in our head and it's not true. And this has happened, last year, this was the 2-class cases, which, it's the right of women, even they are upper class, not even, it's the right for every woman to be protected. This is something, I think it's out of any thing, but you can see how different right groups has been open the sexual violence issues and sexual harassment among them. You saw this within the journalists, for journalists who are pro the regime or were against the regime. It has been opened within the Islamist communities by having one of their professors, the professor which was one of the big icons for them. And this is not about that. It's not only about us, you also know. It's about how this mindset couldn't deal with women body and the issue of violence. It's not about that. It's not only us, it's also you know, it's about how really the violence against women issue is a social epidemic in Egypt before coronavirus came.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give Hoda the floor to wrap up, because I know a lot of work has been done, and I mean, it might not look like it, but a lot of positive things have happened, and I think it's as important to know what has been achieved as what Egypt is trying to achieve. So, but you know much more about that than most people. So can I ask you to?
Yes, sure. I think, okay, so I will say this sort of like maybe controversial statement, which is I strongly believe that the women's movement in Egypt has been the most successful social movement in the 20th century and the 21st century. Absolutely. Despite all the problems, despite all the challenges, despite the fact that we still have this really bad personal status law, it has been the most successful social movement. I think this is something to bear in mind. And the development is incremental and it's ongoing and it has a lot of energy. That's one thing. I believe that one of the gains, the very important gains of the 2011, or what happened in 2011 when spaces opened up and women and men, of course, but there was this opportunity to express yourself, to have agency, to feel that you can actually change things. That has not been lost, despite all the restrictions now. I mean, I think this feeling of your ability to change is a lesson that has been passed on to new generations. This is important. Despite the fact that current debates are still looking at sort of old issues that we've been talking about since the 30s and the 40s, but the discussion is different. I mean, I also want to stress, okay, obviously, someone like me, I would love to see a real shift before I die, but having said that, there is a difference in the discussion. There's more courage. There's a lot of courage. I think, things have changed. Social media has enabled the voice and the agency of many, many young men and women. So there are new voices and there are new perspectives that are being voiced all the time. Definitely, there's a new generation of feminists that is extremely active, that is paying attention, that is politicized to a large extent, which I think is really important. So gone is the apathy that we used to talk about perhaps in certain decades. So I think all of these are very positive things in relation to the movement, in relation to new generations, and hopefully better for all of us.
All right. Thank you so much. We actually have to wrap up. We're out of time, but I would like to thank our two amazing panelists, Dr. Hoda Sadda and Ms. Mosna Hassan. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. We will be posting the recording of this as soon as it's up, and we'll send it around to everyone. So in case there's anything that you missed or in case you'd like to pass it on to anyone else, thank you so much for joining us. And